I forgot to tell my son the camera was already recording. What I saw left me speechless. The screen flickered to life before I could warn him. 3 seconds. That's all it took to shatter everything I thought I knew about my own flesh and blood. My fingers froze on the keyboard as I watched my 17-year-old son transform into someone I didn't recognize. The basement security camera I'd installed last month, meant to catch the neighbor kid who kept breaking in through our garden-level window, had caught something far worse. I couldn't breathe as I watched Thomas slip something from his pocket, a small plastic bag with white powder that glinted under the basement's fluorescent lights. But it wasn't the drugs that made my blood run cold. It was the casual way he handled the gun he pulled out next, turning it over in his hands like it was nothing more than a new phone. Where did he even get it? The timestamp read 3:42 p.m., when he was supposed to be at basketball practice, when I thought he was becoming the man I'd raised him to be. I slammed the laptop shut, my hands trembling so badly I nearly dropped it. The house felt suddenly foreign, like I was standing in a stranger's living room surrounded by photographs of people I'd never met. 15 years of single parenting, of working 2 jobs sometimes, of making sure Thomas had everything his mother would have wanted for him after she died. The sacrifices, the late nights, the parent-teacher conferences I'd rearranged my entire schedule for. All of it flickered through my mind like a slideshow of failure. I'd done everything right, hadn't I? The family photo stared back at me from the mantel. Thomas in his basketball uniform, his graduation from middle school, the fishing trip last summer where he'd caught that huge trout and smiled so wide, I thought his face might split. Was it all a lie? The neighbors always said what a good kid he was. "You've done such a wonderful job with him, Marcus," they'd tell me, especially after losing Sandra so young. I used to believe them. I paced the kitchen, the linoleum cold against my bare feet, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Maybe it wasn't what it looked like. Maybe there was an explanation, but the knot in my stomach tightened with each passing moment. There had been signs, hadn't there? The new friends he wouldn't bring home, the late nights, the dropping grades his teacher had emailed me about just last week. "Thomas seems distracted lately," Ms. Reinhardt had written. "Is everything okay at home?" I'd brushed it off. Senior year pressure, college applications, normal teenage stuff. Now her words haunted me. I should have seen it coming. The way he'd started locking his door. The hushed phone conversations that stopped the moment I walked into the room. Even the sudden influx of cash, the new sneakers, the watch I couldn't afford to buy him. "Side job," he'd said when I asked. Helping Mr. Wilson with yard work. I'd been proud of his initiative, but what I saw next changed everything. As I reopened the laptop with shaking hands, the video continued. Thomas wasn't alone. A shadow moved across the basement wall, and then Jason Walsh stepped into frame, the police sergeant's son, of all people. The same kid who'd given the anti-drug speech at school last year. They huddled together, counting something. Money, I realized with a sickening lurch. Then Thomas said something that made the audio crackle with his laughter. "My dad's so clueless. He thinks I'm at practice right now, as if I care about that scholarship anymore." The words hit me like a physical blow. The basketball scholarship we'd been working toward since he was 12. The one thing that might give him the future his mother and I had dreamed about during those late nights when she was pregnant, planning our son's life while the world slept around us. Before cancer took her when Thomas was just 2. Before I became both mother and father to a boy who apparently saw me as nothing but a fool. I closed the video, unable to watch anymore. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Thomas saying practice was running late and he'd be home for dinner around 7. Another lie. I stared at the message, the casual deception of it burning my eyes. "What do you even say to that?" "Okay, see you then," I typed, my fingers feeling numb and disconnected from my body. I needed time to think, to figure out what to do. Call the police? He's my son. Confront him? With what, a gun in his possession? The walls of our home seemed to close in, the air thick with betrayal. I stumbled to the cabinet where I kept the whiskey I rarely touched, pouring a finger's worth into a coffee mug. It burned all the way down, but the pain was almost welcome. Something real in a world suddenly made of smoke and mirrors. The whiskey bottle clinked against the countertop as I set it down harder than intended. The sound echoed through the empty house, reminding me just how alone I was with this. Sandra would have known what to do. She always knew how to reach Thomas in ways I couldn't. "He has your stubbornness," she used to joke, "but he has my heart." Where was that heart now? I found myself standing in the doorway of his bedroom, A place he'd increasingly declared off limits. Privacy, Dad, he'd insist. That edge of annoyance in his voice that I'd chalked up to normal teenage attitude. Now it felt like the first warning sign I'd missed. The room was meticulously clean. Another recent change. Thomas had never been tidy before. The bed was made, the desk organized. Nothing out of place. Too perfect. Like a hotel room rather than a teenager's space. I'd respected his privacy until now, but that luxury had evaporated with the image of that gun in his hands. It took me 3 tries to find it. Not under the mattress, not in the closet behind his basketball trophies, but inside the hollowed-out SAT prep book on his bookshelf. The irony wasn't lost on me. The test he'd blown off twice now, despite all the tutoring I'd paid for. The gun was smaller than it had appeared on camera, which somehow made it worse. More concealable, more deliberately hidden. Next to it, a wad of cash bigger than my last paycheck. 500? 1,000? I didn't count. Didn't want to know how many deals it represented. I sat on his bed, the weight of the weapon unfamiliar in my palm, and tried to remember when I'd lost him. Was it gradual? Like water wearing away stone? Or was there a moment, a single wrong turn where another choice might have led us somewhere else? The tears came then, silent and hot down my face. 15 years of doing my best, and somehow I'd still failed him. But something else caught my eye as I went to replace the book. The edge of a photograph sticking out from beneath his pillow. I pulled it free, expecting to see some girlfriend I didn't know about. Instead, I found myself staring at Sandra's face. A picture I didn't recognize of her holding infant Thomas in the hospital, her smile radiant despite the exhaustion clear in her eyes. He'd been looking at this, recently, often enough that it wasn't stored away but kept close while he slept. Something in my chest cracked open. What did it mean that my drug-dealing, gun-toting son still reached for his mother's image in his private moments? The complexity of it staggered me. He wasn't just the person I'd seen on that video. He was still somewhere, the little boy who'd lost his mother too young. The sound of the garage door opening sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. He was home, hours earlier than his text had promised. I shoved everything back where I'd found it, my heart hammering against my ribs as I slipped out of his room. I heard his keys hit the counter downstairs, the refrigerator door opening and closing, acting normal, playing his part. I took a deep breath and headed down, unsure of what mask I'd wear to cover the devastation inside me. "Hey," he called out casually when he saw me, a carton of orange juice in his hand, drinking straight from the container like I'd told him 1,000 times not to do. Practice ended early. Another lie, so effortless it almost impressed me. I studied his face. The same brown eyes as his mother, the same cleft in his chin as me, searching for signs of the stranger I'd seen on the video. "Good practice?" I asked, amazed at how steady my voice sounded. He shrugged, that universal teenage gesture that usually irritated me, but now felt like a luxury from simpler times. "Coach is riding us hard before the scout from Duke comes next week." More fabrications piling up between us like a wall being built brick by brick. I nodded as if I believed him, as if we were still the father and son from yesterday, not these new people navigating uncharted territory. "I'm going to shower," he said, already heading for the stairs. I watched him go, this child of my body who had become an enigma. His shoulders had filled out this year. His voice deepened to a man's register. When had that happened? While I was working nights at the warehouse, while I was sleeping? While I was believing in a future that might no longer exist? I couldn't sleep that night, listening to the creaks and shifts of the house, hyper-aware of every sound from Thomas's room across the hall. Was he sneaking out? Making deals? Planning something worse? The digital clock on my nightstand ticked past midnight, then 1, then 2. I scrolled through old photos on my phone. Thomas at 10 missing his front teeth and holding up a soccer trophy. Thomas at 14, all gangly limbs and embarrassed smile as I dropped him off for his first school dance. I'd taken so many pictures over the years, documenting everything as if I could preserve each moment like insects in amber. For Sandra, I'd told myself, so she could see him grow up through my eyes. But maybe it had been for me all along, trying to freeze time, to keep him as that boy who'd cry when he skinned his knee and come running to me for comfort. The next morning arrived with cruel brightness, sunlight streaming through blinds I'd forgotten to close. Thomas was already gone. Saturday morning practice, real or imagined. I found a note on the counter. Went early to work on free throws, back by noon. The familiar handwriting twisted something inside me. I made coffee I couldn't taste and pulled up the security footage again, forcing myself to watch the entire thing. There was more. So much more. They were planning something. Thomas and Jason. Something for next Friday night. The drop is at midnight, Thomas said on the screen, his voice distorted by the cheap microphone. We'll have the whole shipment by 1, and the buyers are meeting us at the old factory at 2. 20 grand, minimum. $20,000. The number echoed in my head as I watched them fist bump like they'd just planned a video game session. Not what sounded like a major drug deal. I should call the police. That's what a responsible citizen would do. But could I turn in my own son? Watch him go to jail? His future evaporating like morning dew? And what about Jason Walsh, the sergeant's son? Would they even believe me? Or would they close ranks, protect their own? I thought about Sandra again, wondering what she'd say if she could see us now. You have to save him, Marcus. I could almost hear her whisper. Whatever it takes. But how do you save someone who doesn't think they need saving? I picked up my phone, put it down, picked it up again. There had to be another way. Something hidden in the shadows between surrender and destruction. That's when I found it. The other video file I hadn't noticed before. Dated 3 months ago from when the camera was still pointed at the back door rather than the full basement. Thomas sitting alone on the steps, his head in his hands. I couldn't see his face, but his shoulders were shaking. He was crying, sobbing, actually, in a way I hadn't seen since he was small. The timestamp showed 2:17 a.m. Where had I been? Asleep, most likely, oblivious to my son's pain just 1 floor below me. He lifted his head eventually, wiping roughly at his face, and that's when I saw it. Sandra's locket in his hand, the silver one with her picture inside that had disappeared from my dresser last year. I'd torn the house apart looking for it, that last tangible piece of her I carried with me. And all this time he'd had it. He clutched it like a lifeline, whispering something I couldn't make out before tucking it into his shirt. The tough kid with the gun and drugs had stolen his dead mother's locket to wear against his heart. The revelation staggered me, complicated everything. This wasn't a simple story of a good kid gone bad. This was my son, carrying grief I thought he'd processed long ago, hidden behind walls I couldn't see over. What else didn't I know? What other pain was he hiding? I closed the laptop, feeling like a voyeur in my own son's emotional life. We'd stopped talking, really talking, somewhere along the way. After Sandra died, I'd been so focused on being strong, on providing stability, that maybe I'd never shown him how to navigate loss, how to carry it without being crushed. Had I created this situation with my stoic silences, my inability to speak her name without my voice cracking? Had he learned from me that real pain must be hidden away? The front door slammed, jolting me from my thoughts. Thomas was back, drenched in sweat that might or might not have come from basketball practice. "Hey," he said, barely glancing my way as he headed for the stairs. Something in me snapped, not in anger, but in desperate need to bridge whatever chasm had opened between us. "Wait," I called after him. "Let's go get lunch. That new burger place you wanted to try." He paused, surprise flickering across his features, quickly replaced with suspicion. When had my son started looking at me like that, like I had an angle, an agenda? "I've got plans," he said, already turning away. "With who?" I asked, hating the interrogation in my voice but unable to stop myself. He stiffened, defenses rising visibly. "Friends," he answered, the word a wall between us. "You don't know them." "I used to know all your friends," I said, the words slipping out before I could catch them. Thomas rolled his eyes, the gesture so dismissive it physically hurt. "Yeah, well, people change." 4 syllables that contained multitudes. I watched him disappear upstairs, listened to his bedroom door close with a finality that echoed through the house. People change. Was that what this was? Normal evolution from boy to man? Or something darker? A transformation I should have prevented? I sank onto the couch, suddenly exhausted by the weight of questions without answers. The security camera had shown me what my son was doing, but not why, not how to fix it, not whether it could be fixed at all. But then I found something that changed everything. While Thomas was in the shower, his phone lit up with a text message on the kitchen counter. I'd never invaded his privacy that way before, but desperate times and all that. The message preview showed just enough. "Got the stuff from Martinez. He says next time price goes up. These rich kids don't know how good they've got it. It was from Jason, and it confirmed my worst fears while adding new dimensions I hadn't considered. Rich kids. They were dealing to wealthy students. I knew Jason's family lived in the expensive part of town, but we were solidly middle class at best. Was Thomas trying to climb some invisible social ladder? Impress friends from another world? Before I could process it, another message came through. Don't forget the piece tomorrow night. Martinez said his cousins play rough. The piece. The gun. Tomorrow night. Whatever they were planning had accelerated. I replaced the phone exactly as I'd found it, my mind racing. One day. I had one day to figure out how to save my son from whatever he was walking into. The shower shut off upstairs and I moved away from the counter, trying to look natural when he came down dressed in clothes I didn't recognize. Expensive clothes. Jeans that cost more than my dress shoes. A watch I definitely hadn't bought him. I'm heading out, he said, not quite meeting my eyes. Might be late. No details, no explanations. Thomas, I said, his name coming out more pleading than I intended. We should talk. He paused at the door, something flickering across his face. Guilt? Fear? For a moment I thought he might actually open up. Then his expression shuttered, closed again. Nothing to talk about, Dad. Everything's fine. Fine. Such a useless word. Nothing was fine. My son was dealing drugs and carrying a gun, meeting someone named Martinez whose cousins play rough, and he thought everything was fine. I watched from the window as he climbed into Jason Walsh's car, a new Audi his police sergeant father had bought him for his birthday. They pulled away and I made my decision. I wasn't going to lose my son. Not to jail, not to violence, not to whatever path he was careening down. I grabbed my keys and followed them, hanging back just enough to avoid detection. They drove to the wealthier side of town, to a sprawling house set back from the road behind ornate iron gates. I parked down the street, watching as they were buzzed in like expected guests. Whose house? What was happening inside? I sat there for almost 2 hours, ignored calls from work, and waited until they emerged again. Thomas laughing at something Jason said as they got back in the car. They made 2 more stops, brief visits to upscale homes where they stayed less than 15 minutes each. Deals, almost certainly. I followed them to their final destination, a diner on the edge of town where they met 3 other boys I vaguely recognized from school events, all of them from wealthy families, all of them treating my son like he belonged at their table. I watched through the window as Thomas held court, the others laughing at his jokes, deferring to him in a way I'd never seen before. Was that what this was about? Status? Acceptance? The pathological need to belong that drives so many teenage disasters? I'd always thought I'd given him enough. Love, stability, a decent home. But maybe in a world of Audis and gated houses, it had never been enough for him. By the time I got home, a plan was forming. Not a good plan, maybe, but the only one I had. I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years, then spent the evening researching what I'd seen, trying to understand the world my son was inhabiting. Martinez was a name that appeared in several local news articles. Drug busts, weapons charges, gang affiliations. The old factory they'd mentioned had to be the abandoned textile mill on the outskirts of town, a known trouble spot the police raided periodically. $20,000 wasn't street corner dealing, it was serious distribution. My son wasn't just experimenting or rebelling, he was in deep with dangerous people. The realization nearly buckled my knees. How had we come so far from the boy who'd cried when he accidentally stepped on a caterpillar in our backyard? Thomas came home late, smelling faintly of cigarettes and something sweeter, more chemical. He mumbled a good night and disappeared into his room. I sat in the darkness of the living room long after, turning over possibilities like stones in a river, looking for the path that led to safety. By morning, I knew what I had to do. I called Jason's father, Sergeant Walsh, and asked to meet privately at a coffee shop across town. I'd never liked the man much. He carried his authority like a weapon, always ready to remind people of his position. But he was still a father, still someone who should care about his son's future as much as I cared about Thomas's. Or so I thought. I know what they're doing, I said once we were seated in a back corner, away from curious ears. Walsh's expression gave nothing away, his cop face firmly in place. I have video of them with drugs and a gun. They're planning something at the old factory tonight. I'd expected shock, anger, perhaps fear. What I got was something altogether different. A slow smile spread across his face, utterly devoid of warmth. "Marcus," he said, my name sounding like an accusation in his mouth. "I think you're confused about a lot of things." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Those boys are doing important work. Controlled work." The implication hit me like a slap. "You're using them as informants? They're 17. My voice rose despite myself, drawing glances from nearby tables. Walsh's expression hardened. "Keep your voice down. Your son volunteered. Said he wanted to make a difference, do something that matters. More than you ever gave him credit for." The betrayal was breathtaking. Not just from my son, but from this man who should have protected children, not weaponized them. "It's too dangerous," I insisted. "These aren't kids they're dealing with." Walsh shrugged, the gesture dismissive. "They're supervised. We have undercover officers nearby." But his eyes shifted away when he said it, and I knew he was lying. Budget cuts had hit the department hard. Everyone knew they were understaffed. "I want him out," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Tonight. Whatever you're planning, Thomas isn't part of it anymore." Walsh's laugh was short and ugly. "That's not your call, Marcus. This operation has been in the works for months. Your boy's been very useful. Turns out the rich kids trust him because he's authentic." His words, not mine. Authentic, because we didn't live behind gates. Because his mother died of cancer instead of vacationing in Europe. Because I worked with my hands instead of pushing papers. The rage that rose in me then was unlike anything I'd felt before. "I'll go to the chief," I threatened, knowing even as the words left my mouth how hollow they sounded. Walsh's smile widened. "With what? Accusations that we're using minors as informants? Where's your proof? Those videos you mentioned? The ones you got by spying on your own son? The ones showing him with drugs and a weapon?" He shook his head in mock disappointment. "Not a great look for Father of the Year, Marcus. Besides, the chief signed off on this program personally." He stood up, adjusting his jacket with deliberate casualness. "Your son's doing something good here. Be proud of him for once instead of trying to control everything." The parting shot landed with precision, leaving me alone at the table with cold coffee and the dawning realization that I was completely, utterly outmatched. I spent the day in a haze, trying to think of options that didn't end with Thomas in jail, or worse. I could go to the media, blow the whole operation open. But who would believe me over the police department? I could take Thomas and run, but how far would we get? By evening, I was no closer to a solution. Thomas came home to change, barely acknowledging my presence as he rifled through his closet. I stood in his doorway, watching him select clothes with careful deliberation. "Don't go," I said finally, the words hanging between us. He turned, really looking at me for the first time in what felt like forever. "What?" he asked, confusion knitting his brows together. "Whatever's happening tonight," I continued, stepping into the room. "Don't be part of it." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, then suspicion. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but the lie lacked his usual confidence. "I saw the videos, Thomas, from the security camera in the basement." I watched the color drain from his face, saw his eyes dart to the drawer where the gun was hidden. "I know about the drugs. The gun, Martinez, all of it." He sank onto the bed, the carefully selected outfit forgotten beside him. "How long have you known?" he asked, his voice smaller than I'd heard it in years. "Long enough," I answered, sitting beside him, close but not touching. "Walsh told me the rest today." His head snapped up at that, eyes wide with genuine fear. "You talked to Sergeant Walsh? Are you crazy? Do you have any idea what he's capable of?" The question chilled me. What did my 17-year-old son know about a police sergeant that put that look on his face? "Tell me," I said. "Tell me everything, Thomas. No more lies." And finally, he did. The words poured out of him like a dam breaking. The whole sordid story laid bare. Walsh had approached him 6 months ago after catching him with a small amount of marijuana. Instead of arresting him, he'd offered him a deal. Work as an informant to infiltrate the wealthy drug scene at school, or face charges that would end his college prospects. He said it would just be information at first, Thomas explained, his hands twisting together in his lap. Names, who was buying what. But then he wanted me to start dealing, to get closer to the suppliers. Jason was already doing it. His dad's been using him for years. The gun had been Walsh's idea too. Protection, supposedly. The operation had grown beyond what either boy had signed up for, with Walsh pushing them to take more risks, make bigger deals. "He's building a case for promotion," Thomas said bitterly. Doesn't care what happens to us in the process. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. The missing basketball practices, the money, the new friends, all of it orchestrated by a man abusing his authority and exploiting teenagers for his own advancement. The drop tonight, I said, my mouth dry with fear. What exactly is supposed to happen? Thomas looked away, shame evident in the slump of his shoulders. Martinez is bringing in a major shipment. We're supposed to make the buy, then lead him to the factory where the rich kids will be waiting to purchase. Walsh and his team are supposed to bust everyone there. He looked back at me, eyes shining with unshed tears. But Dad, I don't think they're going to be there. Not in time, anyway. Last time they were supposed to back us up and nobody showed until it was almost too late. I think... His voice broke. I think Walsh doesn't care if something happens to us. Might even prefer it. 2 troubled teens caught in drug violence makes a cleaner story than admitting he used minors as bait. The truth of it hit me like a physical blow. My son wasn't a criminal. He was a pawn, a sacrificial piece in someone else's game. And he'd been carrying this burden alone, wearing his dead mother's locket like a talisman while walking into danger, orchestrated by people who should have protected him. You're not going, I said, the decision crystallizing with perfect clarity. We're ending this tonight. Thomas shook his head, panic rising in his expression. You don't understand. If I don't show, Martinez will know something's wrong. He'll come looking for me. For us. The implication hung heavy in the air between us. These weren't people who accepted broken deals or loose ends. Then we give them what they're expecting, I said slowly, an idea forming. Just not the way they think. What happened next unfolded with the surreal quality of a fever dream. I called in every favor I'd ever accumulated in 15 years of being a stand-up guy in this town. My brother-in-law who worked at the local news, the principal who still remembered how I'd helped his son after a drunk driving incident, the retired judge who lived next door and had always had a soft spot for Thomas. By 10 o'clock, a plan was in motion that Walsh would never see coming. Thomas texted Jason, telling him he'd meet him at the drop point directly. Then we waited, father and son sitting together in my truck outside the abandoned gas station where Martinez was supposed to appear with the drugs. Are you sure about this? Thomas asked, his voice steady despite the fear I could sense radiating from him. I looked at my boy, because despite everything, that's what he still was, and nodded. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Martinez arrived right on schedule, flanked by 2 hard-faced men who scanned the surroundings with practiced efficiency. I squeezed Thomas's shoulder once, then stepped out of the truck, walking toward them with measured steps. The confusion on their faces when they saw me instead of 2 teenagers was almost comical. Who the fuck are you? Martinez demanded, one hand drifting toward his waistband. I held up both hands, showing them empty. Marcus Williams, Thomas's father. Recognition flickered in Martinez's eyes. He'd clearly heard my son's name before. Where's the kid? He asked, suspicion heavy in his voice. And Walsh's boy? I maintained eye contact, keeping my voice level despite the fear coursing through me. There's been a change of plans. The police know about tonight. All of it. Martinez cursed, glancing at his companions who had both drawn weapons now. And why would you tell me this? You working with the cops too? I shook my head, taking a calculated risk by stepping closer. I'm working for my son. Walsh has been using him, using all of you. He doesn't care who gets hurt tonight as long as he gets his promotion. I could see the calculation happening behind Martinez's eyes, the rapid assessment of truth versus trap. The local news has the whole story, I continued. Anonymous source provided evidence of police corruption, using minors as informants, endangering lives. It airs tomorrow morning unless something happens to me or my son tonight. Martinez's laugh was unexpected, a sharp bark of genuine amusement. You've got balls, old man. I'll give you that. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded slightly. So what exactly are you proposing here? You leave town tonight. No deal, no drop, no factory meeting. Everybody walks away clean. I held his gaze, willing him to see the logic. Walsh loses his big bust, but you lose the police attention. Seems like a fair trade. Martinez considered this, head tilted slightly. My business associates won't be happy about the lost opportunity. I nodded, acknowledging the point. Better than lost freedom, or lost lives. Another long silence stretched between us, broken only by the distant sound of traffic from the highway. Finally, Martinez smiled. Not a nice smile, but one that suggested a certain professional respect. Tell your boy he's out. Permanently. If I see him again in my business, Daddy won't be able to save him next time. Relief flooded through me, nearly buckling my knees. Understood, I managed to say, backing away slowly. Martinez and his men returned to their vehicle without another word, disappearing into the night as suddenly as they'd appeared. I collapsed back into the truck, hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. They're gone, I told Thomas, who had watched the entire exchange with wide eyes. It worked. He stared at me like he'd never seen me before. Dad, that was... He struggled to find the words. That was insane. How did you know they wouldn't just shoot you? I started the engine, pulling away from the cursed meeting spot as quickly as I dared. I didn't, I admitted. But I know people like Martinez understand business risks. Walsh was the bigger threat to his operation. Thomas sat in stunned silence as I drove, heading not home but to my brother-in-law's house on the other side of town. We can't go home tonight, I explained. Walsh will be looking for us once he realizes the operation fell apart. The next morning, the story broke exactly as planned. Police sergeant accused of using minors as drug informants screamed the headline across every local news outlet. My brother-in-law had done his job perfectly, presenting the evidence we'd provided, including carefully edited segments of the security footage that showed Thomas with drugs but protected him from the worst legal exposure, while keeping our role as the source confidential. By noon, the police chief had called a press conference. Walsh was on administrative leave and an internal investigation was underway. The retired judge had ensured Thomas would receive immunity in exchange for his testimony about police misconduct. It wasn't a perfect solution. There would be fallout, investigations, difficult questions, but it was a path forward that didn't end with my son in prison. Or worse, dead in an abandoned factory. It took 6 months for the dust to settle. Walsh ultimately pled guilty to multiple charges of endangering minors and misuse of police authority. Jason entered a diversion program, his father's disgrace seemingly enough punishment for the family. Thomas, my Thomas, had to complete community service and drug counseling, but his record would be expunged if he stayed clean. We talked more in those 6 months than we had in the previous 6 years. About his mother, about the grief he still carried, about the locket he'd taken because he'd needed something of hers to hold on to when the pressure became too much, about the ways I'd failed him by trying to be strong instead of vulnerable, by showing him how to provide, but not how to feel. We were rebuilding, piece by broken piece. The basketball scholarship was gone. That dream had died somewhere along the way, but others took its place. Thomas discovered an interest in criminal justice reform, sparked by his own experience being exploited by a broken system. He started volunteering at a youth center, talking to kids about the choices he'd made and the ones they still could. I watched him grow into this new purpose with a pride that sometimes felt too big for my chest to contain. We were different people now, both of us changed by what had happened, but perhaps in some ways we were better versions of ourselves, more honest, more connected, more aware of how easily we could have lost each other. On the anniversary of Sandra's death, I found Thomas sitting on the back porch, her locket open in his palm. I sat beside him without speaking, looking at the tiny photograph inside, her face frozen in time, never aging, never changing. "Do you think she'd be disappointed in me?" he asked finally, his voice small against the gathering dusk. I put my arm around his shoulders, feeling the solid strength of him. No longer a child, not quite a man, but somewhere precious in between. "No," I said with absolute certainty. "She'd be proud of who you're becoming, who you fought to be." He leaned against me then, a gesture so reminiscent of his childhood self that my heart ached with it. "I'm sorry, Dad," he whispered, "for everything." I tightened my grip on his shoulder, words momentarily beyond me. "I'm sorry too," I managed finally, "for not seeing what you needed, for not being the father you deserved." He shook his head against my shoulder. "You saved me," he said simply. "When it mattered most, you showed up." We sat there as darkness fell completely, two imperfect people bound by blood and choice and forgiveness. The security camera that had started it all had long since been removed, no longer necessary in a house where truth had finally found a home. Sometimes I still thought about that moment when I first saw the footage, the shock, the fear, the sense that I'd lost my son completely. But now I understood it differently. That wasn't the moment I lost him. It was the moment I found him again. That night, after Thomas went to bed, I stood in the hallway between our rooms, listening to the quiet sounds of my son sleeping safely under our roof. So many things could have gone differently. So many moments where another choice would have led us down darker paths. I thought about the gun I'd found in his room, now turned over to the police as evidence against Walsh. I thought about Martinez and his cold, calculating eyes. I thought about a future that almost slipped through my fingers because I'd been too busy providing to see what was happening right in front of me. The house creaked and settled around us, the familiar sounds of home. I made a silent promise to Sandra, wherever she was, that I would do better, be better, see our son not just with my eyes but with my heart. In the morning I woke to find Thomas had made breakfast. Nothing fancy, just cereal and coffee. But he'd set the table for both of us. A small gesture, but one that spoke volumes. "I thought we could eat together before school," he said, a question in his voice even as he tried to sound casual. I nodded, taking the chair across from him. "I'd like that," I said. He smiled then, the real smile I'd missed for too long, and I knew with absolute certainty that whatever came next, we would face it together. That day, they finally realized who we really were. Not just father and son, but warriors who would go to any length to protect each other from the darkness that had nearly claimed us both.